working. We're a social business. As I said, I founded TimeWise 15 years ago with my partner Karen Matheson. We do three things. We do a huge amount of research, kind of thought leadership, and I guess a bit of policy work to sort of champion the benefits of flexibility. 15 years ago, we were very much in the why space. We have now shifted into the how space. So the second thing we do in that context is we provide a range of consultancy and training services to businesses who want to enhance their approach to flexibility. And our services range from change programs through to training managers to manage dispersed teams, through to training people how to do hybrid working, through to cultural and sort of leadership programs. And then the last thing that we do is we run a job site. And for us as a social business, we are driven by a mission in all of our work to make sure that we hope everybody gets the flexibility they need in work without compromising their careers. And whilst we know that flexible working can work incredibly well, it can, at the hard end of the labour market, often not work well. The lack of flexibility can prohibit women from progressing in work. It can create all kinds of issues in terms of inequality in the labour market. And ultimately, it can trap people either out of work or not being able to progress in work because they can't find good quality flexible jobs to apply for. We hope that is changing, but in the meantime, our job site is there for around about 100,000 candidates who want their next job to be a good job and a flexible job, and we advertise those roles to them. So that's us. Our client base ranges from Tesco to Google to Lloyds Banking Group to major NHS trusts to the Scottish Government. So we have a very broad sort of church of experience in terms of working with different firms. And I think some of you we've recently been foraying into construction. I think there's some construction people on this group. So you know we understand, I guess, the operational as well as the cultural constraints that face different businesses, and as I said, that how bit is the bit that we're really keen to address. So that's us. So in terms of what have we learned, if I start with that, so we've had almost a year of enforced home working, and it's really important to make a distinction between what we've been forced to do for the last year and what good flexible working looks like. And there's a sort of spectrum. Some of us are probably in the good flexible space. Many firms are still in the forced remote working space. But we've learned some tough but good lessons about what that has meant for how we manage our people and get our jobs done. The first, I think, lesson we've learned is many of the reasons in theory to say no to people working flexibly have been busted. The assumptions and the reasons to say no. Often, and research kind of supports this, managerial reasons will often be around trust, and they will be around a concern that people can't necessarily deliver and perform as well as they should do if they can see them. We've disproven that completely over the last year. We now know that many kinds of roles that were not considered possible to be flexed, asset managers working from home, trading, which was never ever a kind of feasible assumption in financial services, to name but one, we can do it. And we've also learned that we can really fast track when it comes to digital transformation. So in the NHS, we have seen some phenomenal shifts around digital that have been discussed for many years, but just been forced to implement. So the reasons to say no are starting to be busted. We've learned that working from home has kind of humanised us. We've seen people's lives. Business leaders who have done this well have had higher ratings in terms of their profile and engagement when they have opened up and they have democratised effectively the approach around flexibility. We've learned that, and I think one of the things we need to think about going forward in terms of internal communications is we should no longer be thinking about those flexible workers as we all in some way have had to work flexibly, and that message is really, really important when it comes to thinking about ED&I and how we approach this and how we persuade our teams to continue to work in a different way. We've also learned that we can be as productive, and although it's fair to say that all the pulse surveys and analysis, and I'm sure this is reflected in your work, over probably the first sort of 6 months, highlighted in the main a maintaining of or enhancement of productivity. What we're seeing is a shift now in this last lockdown. This last 3 to 4 months has certainly created some strain, and where we are seeing productivity fall off, classically, obviously, it's to do with parents and homeschooling and issues around restriction. It's also to do with high proportions of furlough, where people have additional work. But interestingly, if you look at that in the context of flexibility, there's starting to emerge a bit of a correlation between engaged teams, high functioning teams, and those that have managers who are capable and equipped to support them to work differently. And it's emerging data, but we think that's quite important. And we've also crucially uncovered, although for many of us it was known beforehand, how much in demand flexibility is. How many people in the UK want and need to have more control over how much, when and where they work. So, I mean, there's loads of surveys, but, estimates suggest that around about 70% of the workforce want to retain some form of flexibility and control in working differently going forward. The challenge will be how we meet that demand and how we do it in a fair way. So we've learned some good things, but there's some warning signs as well, many of which you will be facing into in a hard and fast way. So again, well-being, we all know, is under considerable strain. We have blurred boundaries, we have work creep. Recent surveys suggested that the UK on average workforce is working 2 hours more a day than pre-pandemic. What's quite concerning is that in many European countries are going back to standard hours. The UK is continuing from a workforce perspective to work at least 2 hours additional to what we were doing before. So we have a strain based on how we're working. We also have isolation. We have people who are working at home who don't necessarily want to work from home. They are disconnected. We have challenges around onboarding. Many of us haven't been onboarding people over the last year, but it is going to start to pick up. And we know that for our younger workforce, it's much harder because they are not necessarily set up to work from home. And critically, from an ED&I perspective, we've learned that not everyone has had the same experience. And I think that perspective cannot be reinforced any more than we are already. And it's a really important narrative when it comes to communicating internally with our people. Again, you'll know all of this, but from a gender perspective, women have been disproportionately hit through this experience. More have dropped out of work due to caring responsibilities. There has been a disproportionate amount of other caring homework taken up by women as opposed to men. 70% of women have been denied furlough who requested it. So there are some serious concerns around kind of gender inequality, and the women, various government reports are coming out at the moment. We know obviously that the gender pay gap announcement, I'm sure you've all seen, is that firms are still being required to report if you are large enough, over 250 employees, but we'll have an additional 6 months. The point about gender is important, and we also know that from a demographic age perspective, as I said earlier, there are some real issues both for people at the sort of beginning of their careers and also at the end of their careers as well. The other thing that we've really spotted, and again it won't be news, is this is not the same for every sector and every role. We have a risk in our organisations of the potential of creating a two-tier workforce, where we have those whose jobs can be done from home doing so, and those whose jobs can't be done from home not doing so. And there are some real issues around fairness and consistency that we need to be thinking about as we kind of evolve into a new normal. So just some reflections on what we've learnt. What do we need to do in order to tackle some of this stuff, to keep the good things and to tackle some of the risks? So I guess I would sort of want to unpack this into 3 areas really. And again, all of this is based on work that we've been doing with organisations who are facing into this. The first is cultural and behaviour.
piece. And again, you will all know this, but many firms are still looking at the sort of return to office from a transformation perspective as very much sitting within a kind of technological and an estate planning piece. But what we know is that before COVID, the culture and the behaviours associated with flexible working was in the main, at a management level for many organisations, quite a reactive one. We talk about it at Timewise as a sort of request response model, which is the assumption is an individual will ask to work flexibly. Even the legislation, the right to request, you sort of, you are hired into a role on certain hours. If you want to work differently, then you have to talk to your manager about it. And we all know, there's good reason for that. The challenge with that kind of reactive model is it completely puts the onus on the individual. And from a talent perspective, it can be really challenging because many individuals are not necessarily able to or equipped to have a conversation about how they need to change their hours in the context of a team. We need a dual conversation, and we need a proactive conversation between manager and individuals in this brave new world we are in now, where we think about how tasks can be done differently and what that means for other people. So, the classic example is often I'd like to work part-time. I'd like to go from 5 days to 3. Manager's anxious. Okay, fine. I don't want to lose you, so I'll say yes. Where does the conversation about those extra 2 days go? Are the 2 days consumed? Do they get passed on to a team member? Is there a sense of unfairness because of the weight of pressure? There are all kinds of conversations that don't happen when we think about flexibility that we now proactively need to start stimulating. And we know from some research that we did a few years ago with the Chartered Management Institute, currently, or rather up until last year, only 1 in 5 managers had a conversation with their team members at an annual appraisal or review about how they were working. So not just what output were they delivering, but was the way that they were working enabling them to work in their best way. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about kind of formal changes in flexible working, but informal flex, which is what we are in the main all doing now. And I just challenge that if managers aren't proactively having those conversations, then we have non-conversations. Individuals may not necessarily bring it up, or they may feel there's a stigma associated with it. And the risk is people leave, the risk is people or propose jobs that are redesigned differently that aren't necessarily going to stick and work effectively. So we need a shift from reactive to proactive. We are all on that journey anyway. And within that, there are some very simple things. Well, simple to say, hard to enact. Leadership and having a kind of really clear view and vision, obviously, is something going forward that we would hope our business leaders will be able to aspire to, and we need to be help them to articulate that. Flexible working policies, no longer enough. If we're going to stimulate these kind of conversations and help people to work in a hybrid way, we need guidance and we need frameworks for our organisations about what that needs to look like. How are we going to define it, what the parameters are, what is possible, what's not possible, and some myth busting from business leaders to support that. Secondly, this isn't all about just managers and HR and businesses having to drive this. This is about trusting teams and empowering teams to have these conversations and to communicate a lot. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the examples of how that works well. But what works for one team won't necessarily work for another team. And there is an assumption at the moment when we come to hybrid, for many excos we're talking to, that we just need a rule. Is it 3 days, 2 days, office, home, what is it? Actually, the best way to do this is to think about it from a team-based perspective. And then the other point in terms when it comes to culture and behaviours is recognising that whilst flexible working for many, many years has been a very powerful tool when it comes to ED&I, it's broader than that now. This is about thinking about how, from a business-led perspective, we think about performance management and how we think about making sure that we are able to start to shift behaviours to manage by outputs, not necessarily by inputs. Now that phrase, managed by outputs, again needs unpicking because it's not as easy as it sounds. Which takes me on to the second point. So we've got a kind of cultural behavioural piece. Secondly, there is a really significant skills piece here, which is about helping and equipping our managers to understand how to design work differently and how to manage dispersed teams. And one of the things that we would say, and we are repeatedly saying, is, remote working is only one part of flexible working. So for managers to manage teams well, consistently and fairly, there is a case for looking at how much, when and where we work. We are all doing the where differently. How much, when it comes to part-time and job share, really matters. It matters from a gender perspective, particularly for women. It matters for men who want to spend time with family. It matters from a health perspective. It matters from a well-being perspective. We haven't seen that much shift in part-time working over this last year. So thinking about how much people work matters, and thinking about when people work. If you are HR in a frontline business, if you are in an operationally shift-based environment, then actually flex is all about the when. It's about what shifts, what time, and how do we make sure those rotas and those schedules work for in teams. So being able to help managers to understand what are the parameters and the options for how much, when and where. And then thinking through hybrid, clearly, I'm sure is a big priority for all of you right now. It's a whole topic on itself, because that is about the where and what where are we prepared to consider when it comes to our teams going forward. But just some thoughts. One size doesn't fit all. Again, we would advocate a team-based approach to this, not a new rule of 3 days in the office, 2 days from home. We would advocate a task-based approach. So thinking about what activities and tasks teams need to do. When do you need to communicate and collaborate? Does that collaboration need to be physical face-to-face collaboration, or can it be digitally driven collaboration? And also considering employee life cycles. So thinking about a kind of an approach and a set of principles that you want to adhere to hybrid is going to be really important going forward, and then thinking about how you can support your teams to then map out what those principles mean. So, are we going to always come into the office to onboard someone? Are we always going to come into the office to do performance reviews? Are we going to be at home when it comes to even team meetings? Because actually it's more consistent for all of us to be on Teams going forward. What are the questions you want to ask yourselves to start to think about how you can define, often for your excos, what you think hybrid needs to be? And then the final thought, just in terms of sort of practicalities and what we need to be thinking about going forward, is really, I guess, thinking more deeply about the inclusive approach to all of this. So I've touched on part-time. As I said, remote working has gone from permanently remote, was around about sort of 5-6% pre-pandemic, to around about sort of 60-70%, depending on which research you look at. Part-time's hardly shifted at all. So recognising that if we can equip managers with a deeper understanding around how to redesign roles and how to think about it at a team level, then hopefully we can facilitate some more part-time working. From an inclusive approach, the other thing that we have seen in the market that's really helpful is to move from not just thinking about why, thinking about how, which has taken us into a sort of gender neutral conversation. So it shouldn't be about men or women. And that's really important when it comes to, the pictures you put on your intranet or how you communicate this, but actually thinking about inclusivity from a reason neutral perspective completely. So those organisations that have been doing flex for a long time don't really get managers into a conversation about why do you need this. It's much more about how can you and I facilitate this if you want to work differently, and how can we make that work across the team so we can do it effectively. And then the other point, the last point from an inclusion perspective, I guess is really about behavioural bias and recognising that we are going to have some watch outs, not seen, not in the office, not in the office club, is going to be an issue for many people. And there's some concerns that actually those of us who need to or want to continue to work more remotely, more long term, may miss out. So we need to think about how to address that. And that can be anything from just making sure that there are consistent digital team meetings, that actually, when people do physically connect, it's not always for those important meetings, but it might be for other forms of collaboration. And thinking really carefully about, someone said to me the other day, the business in a meeting often gets done in the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes with those informal chats. So just being really careful that people aren't going to miss out on that going forward. So then just finally, just a couple of thoughts really, I guess, on sort of what good should look like, could look like, and some thoughts for the future. First thing to say is everybody is evolving. You know, we've seen flexible working move over the last 15 years. I think what we're seeing now is an intense period of experimentation. Some things are working, some things aren't. Many of our business clients are still finding their feet, and I think that's okay. We would urge, and we are urging them, not to rush too fast into distinct plans, but to experiment, to test, to pilot, and crucially to make sure that communication is consistent and evolving, to give feedback to teams as to what feels like it's working for the organisation as well as for individuals. But just to give you some examples of some unusual suspects who are doing some interesting things in this space. So we've been doing some work in construction recently, as I mentioned earlier. One of our clients, BAM Construct, have taken the leadership point really seriously. And from a vision perspective, we've worked with them on site teams, looking at how to help those black hats, those workers who are possibly the ones that aren't going to be able to work from home, to be able to have some flex. What they've learned is that roles that they thought could not be done in part remotely actually can be. But what they've also learned is that a lot of that relies on great managers, and they've realised they need to codify when things have worked well in teams with communication, that up and out into leadership comms piece. And their Strapline, I think, is just really simple, but it works really well. Their view is they will have that the same flex will not be available for everyone, but that there is flexibility in every role. And it's just a great starting point, because it says we are open to this, come and talk to us. And we recognise that whether you're shoveling the concrete or you're designing a new CHAD chart or you are in an HR team, there will be some flex for you, and we want to be open and inclusive in that. But what's sitting underneath that is some really clear guidance, some really clear sessions, some champions who are going to disseminate that out across the business so that they can make sure that they get out to everybody and they have those sort of stigma challenging sessions. Second example is just a call out to Lloyds Banking Group, who we've worked with for many years. When I talk about kind of the skills piece and equipping managers differently, they have agile working toolkits, which they brief and give to all of their teams and all of their managers. And it's just a really simple but incredibly effective way to say, when you are onboarding somebody, when you're hiring, or whether you're doing a performance review, at the point that you may have a conversation about how your work is working for you in terms of flexibility, teams have this toolkit, and they can literally, with individuals, work through what are the parameters that we're comfortable with in this role, tick box no, how do we think that's going to impact on the team, and kind of co-create different ways of working. It's a really powerful tool, and it's particularly helped them when it comes to thinking about recruitment, because they are really explicit at the point of hire what flex or flex is not available for each role, and they have seen over the years an increase in uplift in both applications and quality of talent. And many of you will have seen the recent Zurich trial that was done with the Behavioural Insights team, who advertised all jobs as flex at the point of hire. They had a 20% uplift and hire of women, which was fantastic. And then my last example is just a large local authority that we work with, who have, again, lots of different roles, lots of different functions, and just an amazing manager who took the inclusive agenda very seriously. And I was talking to Richard about this earlier. She recognised that she had many parents, she had many people really struggling with crazy hours, with trying to get their work done. Her team was a sort of employability team. They mainly see clients between 9 and 5, face to face. Clearly that had all sort of disappeared. But she just does some really simple things. She had a lot of kind of what she called walking and talking calls. So she didn't do Zoom, because they spent all their day supporting clients on Zoom. She just picked up the phone and she said, I want you to, when I do my one-to-one supervision, I want you to go for a walk now around the park or around wherever you are, come rain or shine, and I'm going to phone you up and we're going to talk to each other. and you're going to walk and get some exercise. And it was just a really simple but really effective way to help her people from not having to do the sort of continual Zoom conversations. She's also made them block out an hour for lunch in their calendars explicitly. She doesn't mind when it is. Some of them have lunch at 3 p.m. But and she has articulated exactly what she needs in terms of targets and outputs. So when they work based on whatever's going on around kids or health or anything else, as long as they have some core overlap time as a team, she doesn't mind because she knows what they're delivering. And as she said, her performance has increased in the team. They feel more empowered, more engaged, more connected. And it was just a really simple example of a manager taking control and doing something quite innovative and different. So that's me. I've got 4 very last thoughts for you, and then really keen to get kind of questions. I guess 4 takeaways from what we've learned, what we've seen, and what's happening in the market. The first is culture and behaviours matter so much. Your internal comms about not going back but going forward is really key. Making sure that people lean in and think proactively about how you want to articulate flex. Secondly, believe that there is flex in every role. Look beyond just remote. Think about hours and think about times that people need to work, but also that interdependency. It will matter from an inclusion perspective hugely. Thirdly, make sure that in the way you articulate this, we think that fair access to flexibility matters. We could do some amazing things and we could learn some amazing things off the back of COVID. But if in 2 years' time, working part-time is still a barrier to progression, then we won't have learnt enough. And if it means that senior people can choose the hours they want, but our junior colleagues have no control, that's not good enough either. So we need to be thinking about how we can evolve the conversation. And then my last sort of plea, I guess, is let's consider flexibility at the point of hire. We know millions want it. We know, even though you could argue in a buyer's market, skill shortages are still there. If you want the best talent, if you want diverse talent, if you want diverse shortlists, the simplest, most effective thing you can do is to articulate that you're open to a conversation about flexible working from day one, not from 6 months in, which is what the law says. And we track the vacancy market every year. We produce a flexible jobs index. For those of you that are interested, it's on our website. Up until last year, the beginning of last year, only 15% of all job vacancies said anything about flexible working from day one on their job ads. In some industries, it was as low as sort of 3-4%. It's now shifted, but it's only 22%. Which is a really astounding thought when you think we've all spent a whole year just working differently. So if we really want to shift how we attract great talent, then one of the simplest things we can do is just be really clear about articulating it at the point of hire. And then we'll make sure that people who've fallen out of work don't stay out of work for too long if they need flex, but more importantly, that we get access to a much wider, more diverse talent pool. So some hopes, some practical tips, some learnings, quite a lot in there, but I'm really happy to answer any questions or reflections that you have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Emma. I love the way you managed to combine both pragmatism and powerful messages as well, which is quite a trick, I think. Impressive stuff.